There's also this question that caught my eye, which is about how do you balance between contrarianism and conspiracy, by Noah Gores, and he's mentioning the example of Richard Werner, who's a professor. I think you might know, but I'm not sure. Tell me if that's the case.
Somebody keeps telling me about him, but I've not actually looked at his stuff, so
he's written
I
this
wouldn't
book, Princes of the Yen. Have you heard of that one? It's about
what's his theory? I'm actually not familiar with his theory. Someone does keep telling me I should look at it, and I haven't yet.
So it's very much about like banks create money and debt, and then he's written extensively about Japan. It has actually influenced my thinking quite a bit, but about the bust of Japan at the end of the 80s. But he is then taking it very much into the sort of, in my opinion, conspiracy side. Where he's like saying this was sort of a mastermind plan by the Japanese central bankers to push neoliberalism on the country by force. But also, like as Noah in the chat is mentioning, he now apparently has a rather extreme take on vaccines. And I remember as well, like checking out his Twitter feed, a lot of chemtrail related messages. But okay, I guess the point of the question is more like, do you see that sort of conflict between contrarianism and conspiracy, and how do you deal with it?
Well, I'm really like, so I'm really cynical about. Look, first of all, I just think these days it's impossible to do good investigative journalism because everything is a conspiracy theory. Like Wirecard is the best example of that. Like, frankly. That was a criminal conspiracy, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And it wasn't a theory, it was just a conspiracy. Now, Dan McCrum and Paul Murphy, who covered that story, they were accused of the most preposterous things. They were all making it up and blah, blah, blah. Yeah. So I find this like entire attitude of like, oh, no, this is a conspiracy theory. It obstructs real journalism. And the real journalism takes something like chemtrails, right? And like, okay, so somebody tells you this chemtrail. Okay, right. I don't know anything about this topic, right? But the journalistic process is, okay, someone tells you a tip. If it's interesting, if there's anything that suggests there's any supporting evidence, well, then you look into it. And then you, like Erin Brockovich, you build a case, right? If there's some sort of pollution or whatever, blah, 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 you build a case, right? And yes, you do tend to have a selective bias when you start doing that process. And that's why in good journalistic practice, you go down the rabbit hole a little bit and then you pull back and then you go and speak to some people who might give you a different perspective. And you try to balance things out. But when the evidence starts to demonstrate that actually there is something to this, you don't constrain it because of fear that you might unfold a conspiracy. Conspiracies are real. Like there are conspiracies out there. Like this idea that there are no conspiracies is silly, right? So what I think has happened maybe is that conspiracy theory itself, in the case of Wirecard, was used as a way. I mean, it became a weapon in discrediting the journalist, right? So when a journalist is like pursuing a story and they're increasingly getting somewhere with it, so often you're then like pushed back, well, this is a conspiracy theory. You don't know what you're talking about, blah, blah, blah. And sometimes that is true. And sometimes you are, taking, 2 and 2 and making 17, right? But other times, and no, oh my God, just in case 17 just came into my head. It's nothing to do with any. Just realized.
17. I don't get the reference, to be honest.
2 and 2 because we're talking about conspiracy theories, and 17 is the Q. So that was accident. Okay. I didn't do it on purpose.
Oh man, I didn't know about that. Okay.
In case anyone but because I did a film about QAnon, and so I know that, but that was an accident.
But does 17 then mean that you're part of the Q side or the other side, or is it not like that at all?
It's just a reference. It's just Q is the 17th letter in the alphabet, so it's just a way of recognizing.
Okay.
It's like this is the bad side of conspiracy theory. So the problem with the QAnon is that they're not trained journalists, so they go out and they start looking. Like they look at the internet and they scour everything and they go, well, this happened at this time, and because that person was in the same room as XYZ, that means they must be connected, and therefore we've got a link, and they are definitely in cahoots, right? That's how QAnon thinks, right? And the reality is that sometimes people will be in the same room and blah, 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 and there's a picture of X with X, and that means blah, blah, blah. And you can investigate it, and then but then you use your judgment, and you go, well, there are lots of circumstances where someone might be in the same room, but they have absolutely nothing to do with that person, right? And you can't just draw a conclusion because two people are in the same picture, right? So a journalist will, I would say someone with good, who follows best practice wouldn't jump to the conclusion that is definitely, you have to maintain the idea that innocent until proven guilty. Like, you've got to make your case. You've got to get more than circumstantial evidence. You've got to treat it like a court case, right? Whereas the QAnons don't do that. They just take X and Y, and they just presume, that means cabal, whatever. And that, I think, is the difference. And they also don't have access. So they don't have the journalists take information, but they also then make calls, and they speak to the people, and they give, if someone's been accused of X or Y, we call them up and we hear their side of the story before we start spreading malicious gossip about them. That's how it's supposed to act. That's how it's supposed to operate, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's the difference between conspiracy theory and journalism, is that journalism is verified. It's, it can be speculative, and you will have narratives and angles and biases, but by and large, you can't make a ridiculous accusation without a hell of a lot of evidence behind what you're suggesting.
Yeah, but now,
so I don't know this Werner guy,
yeah.
But if there is evidence for if there is enough evidence, there's but no smoke without fire, then at a minimum, this was my point with lab leak. I felt there was enough evidence to merit an investigation, right?
Yeah, I looked into this as well. They definitely had a good case. You don't know.
And that's what, and I felt that in that case, conspiracy theory had been weaponized to suppress the investigation. And I think we have to be conscious of the fact that we shouldn't just knee-jerk X says this, so therefore it's a conspiracy theory. Because conspiracy theory then becomes an obstacle to good journalism.
Yeah.
And it becomes stigmatized to do any proper inquiries.
One thing I do wonder.
And often, it's the whole, sometimes people, they say a little knowledge is dangerous. And I've seen that happen so many times with central banking and Bitcoin and crypto. And these people jump to wild conclusions, and it's because they don't know the mechanics. And so they make assumptions that, look, a classic one is QE is money printing.
Yeah.
And I'd be like, no, it's an asset store, it's sterilized, it's not the same thing. And it's because of the economy. And then now, so many years later, I look at that and I go, well, I used to be really annoyed with them saying it's money printing, because I'd be like, no, mechanically, it's blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
But they kind of had a point. And maybe it's a bit basic, and maybe they don't know why they've arrived at the right answer. But we were a bit snobbish in terms of just, sometimes the basic intuitive gut feeling should also not be dismissed. So I've become a little bit more open-minded and pragmatic. And I think sometimes there are so many bad incentives out there for people to push bullshit at you that, frankly, being a bit inclined to think that people are using X or Y as a cover, it doesn't strike me. I mean, there's enough historical record of crazy cover-ups and corporate malpractice to resonate. I don't see what's wrong with doing the investigation, and we don't even get to the investigation point in this day and age. That's my point. If you do the investigation and then you conclude, well, there's nothing here,